I'm with Colin Tudge, and he's just given a 40-minute talk on aspects of agriculture which I never thought I'd hear in Jersey. He actually has, I dare use the word, a socialist view on things. I don't know if he's a socialist, but he's given a socialist view. Is that critical, do you think, to your thinking? Is it?
It's fine, it's good. I mean, socialism, as far as I see it, is just that you actually give a damn about the society in which you live, and indeed you give a damn about humanity as a whole. And you should stretch it nowadays, the sort of environmentalist age, and say we give a damn about the biosphere as a whole, for all sorts of reasons. So yes, I consider myself a socialist.
What I notice about this sort of meeting in Jersey, you get the sort of Jersey intelligentsia, or the landowners come along. You don't get many of the Polish farm workers, the guys who actually do the digging. Not many of those come along to these. What do you find in England when you're going around giving talks and meeting people? Is it the guys who do the digging who are interested?
Well, they might well be interested, but they don't have time and they don't have energy because they've been working too hard. And I suppose they don't own the land. They haven't, if they're a Polish worker in Britain, they haven't got any stake in it really. And it's just, well, I don't honestly know what they think because I haven't talked to many of them.
No.
But the chaps I have talked to, then what they do think, I think, is that Polish agriculture is actually rather good. And traditional Polish agriculture, as I understand it, is very similar to what I'm talking about. You know, small units, very beautifully managed, family units, good communities.
Well, there was a scheme even to get Polish land and Polish farmers to grow Jersey Royal potatoes at one stage, but that fell on its. That didn't get very far because they had surplus land and they had the labour and so on. But there were aspects of your talk which I wish I would have liked to have recorded the whole thing, but it's not very practical. The idea about the value of food, and we don't value food, and you won't pay the proper value for food. But that is rather because the marmoutier potato, I don't know if you know it in France, it's rather similar to Jersey. They put seaweed on it. It commands an extraordinary, it's a real delicacy in Paris, and they pay ridiculous money for a potato because, like the diamonds you were talking about, De Beers, that sort of thing.
It seems to me that all the great civilizations, I mean the civilizations that deserve to be called great, have all to a very significant extent built their civilizations around food and therefore around agriculture. I mean, you know, there's been no greater civilizations than the Chinese over the last 8,000 years, and they have, you know, food is right at the centre of what they do. Same as India, same as Turkey, same as France. I mean, I remember hearing a story about a whole gang of French OAPs going out on a charabanc, and you know the way they do in England. But the point is that it stopped when they got to lunch, because they spent the next hour and a half talking about what they ought to have, and then the other an hour eating it, and so on. And that is really caring about food.
It's certainly strange when I was thinking, when I was listening to you, but the fact there's hundreds of programmes go on television now about food, forever telling us how to cook this, that and the other. But as you were saying, people don't know how to cook food, do they?
There's no real culture there. I mean, I learned to cook from my mother. She doesn't teach me, but you know, that's how you learn. You hang about. I believe in Chinese, if you're trying to learn Japanese cookery, nobody teaches you. You stand there and you absorb it osmotically over several years, and that it actually is the way you really learn things, by being around it happening. I think somebody showing you on the television when you've got no background, you know, you're sort of middle class, you didn't do cooking at school and all that kind of thing. That isn't the way agriculture happens. It has to grow up.
Well, another one of your very strong themes was about the production. It's production led. It's done. Yeah. That sort of motivates.
Well, there's all sorts of things. I mean, the government pushes production. All you ever hear from governments on any front, not just agriculture, is we must have growth. But basically growth is largely spurious because it's just growth of money, which doesn't mean any growth at all. But also, when they are talking about real things, they're talking about producing more and more and more and flogging it abroad. Even in agriculture, the last two Secretaries of State, Liz Truss is the present one, Owen Paterson was the previous one, I've heard them give major speeches, keynote speeches. Owen Paterson said by January 2014, British farmers must produce more and more beef to sell to the Chinese. Money, more and more. Liz Truss said in 2015 must produce more and more pork to sell to the Chinese because they've got money, etc. And now they were saying 2016, she said we must be exporting biotech, i.e. GM. Not that we grow them, but we've got the technology because we're good at it. Irrespective of whether growing GM crops does anybody any good, and in fact in many places it would be seriously harmful, it would wreck the local economy, etc, etc, etc. So it's all about not just growth of more and more stuff, but mainly about more and more money.
I was also very interested in your what you were saying about the myth of the fact that the world can't feed itself, and you were saying it already feeds itself in abundance. It's just...
Well, we don't feed ourselves because there's 1 billion people hungry out of 7 billion. But we do produce enough for 14 billion.
That's right.
So it's all going down the throats of, or lots of it being thrown away, lots of it's going down the throats of cattle who don't actually need all that grain, or don't really need any at all if you boil it down, and so on. The main point is not that people are trying to produce food for people. They are trying to produce food that they can basically produce huge surpluses, which you then waste in lucrative ways and pretend.
Yeah, well, I was ready, of course, again, it was the socialist angle which appealed to me especially. This fair distribution of, whether it's wealth or food or whatever it might be, land, access to land, all these things. I mean, this is a naive view of socialism, isn't it?
Well, without this is sort of common justice, and without common justice, we're sunk. It doesn't matter what we do. You can't technologise yourself out of it.
Were you brought up in that sort of thinking, or did you come back? Did you discover it for yourself?
Well, in a sense, my parents, this was just after the war, were quite politically neutral. They went along with the act, basically. They liked Whitty, Churchill in other words, because he was a great man. But I was brought up in a place where socialism was clearly the appropriate course, if you know whatever. Of course you shared everything, of course everything was fair, however else you couldn't survive. I mean, we weren't poor, but it was just South London. That's how you got along.
Because it was interesting. The lady was sort of trying to say, how do you affect change? You were saying to change things gradually. How you can do it is very difficult. Revolution won't work. And the lady was saying, well, of course, basically, as you won't be aware, but there is no political party to speak of in Jersey. There's a very small embryo one trying to get going. Politics isn't organised here, and in that sort of a culture, it's very difficult to move anything towards any sort of change, isn't it?
You're talking about Jersey specifically?
This is Jersey specifically.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's no real political will as far as I can see, apart from maintaining the status quo.
But there was you were talking about a college for teaching the sort of things you're in agricultural sense. What do the existing agricultural colleges teach then? Don't they teach this overall view of it, or do they have a rather now?
Yeah, well, in detail I don't know, and there may be a few that are doing good things. On the whole, they teach industrial agriculture, and there certainly have been times when there are still, where basically farmers are taught that you apply certain fertilisers at certain times and certain pesticides at certain times, and that's it. When I worked for Farmers Weekly for a time in the early 70s, and they used to call that farming by numbers. Well, not farming by numbers would be the norm.
Of course, as you touched on, you don't know Jersey that much, but it's down to basically a 2-crop milk and potatoes now, which is obviously very, very vulnerable. It's almost as vulnerable for agriculture as finances for the whole island. So it's ironic as well, because the cows, they weren't for eating normally, they were for producing milk. That was the traditional role. Obviously some did get eaten, and they've tried a few beef animals here now. But this little island, obviously it never was sustainable in food. Never was self-sufficient. It could never produce enough food by any traditional method. This little island can't produce enough food to supply itself.
The Jersey, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you've only got 100,000 people here, I believe.
That's right.
Well, you've got how many? You've got 45 square miles? Something like that?
That's right.
9 by 7, it's about 45, yeah.
That ought to be loads.
Well, but not by any known traditional method. It never has worked. It's never been done.
But I find this hard. I mean, the point is that the kind of farming I would like to see is basically small mixed farms.
Right.
Very skills intensive, very low input, in other words, not organic. Well, it's been demonstrated all over the world that these farms can be extremely productive, as productive.
Well, yeah, they can. But there were 1,100 dairy farms just after the war. There are now 20. You see, but they're supplying a much increased population, and they're going to try and supply China. But that's another story.
But I mean, it's pretty obvious that milk alone doesn't feed a nation.
No.
Doesn't feed anybody. But again, if it was mixed, cattle, potatoes.
Well, they were small
horticulture.
They were little self-sufficient small holdings, selling a bit of produce, exporting a bit of produce, and they jogged along.
Well, I'm sure that Jersey, if it focused on being so, could be self-sufficient several times over.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely potential in that.
I've got Glyn here. Do you want to come a bit closer, Glyn? I can get you both on the screen here. You can join the discussion. I mean, I keep reading on the internet about little. I live in a 14-storey building where agriculture is in 14-storey buildings, where in fact my building would lend itself beautifully to be converted to a factory production up in the sky, not on the ground at all. Is that a sort of a scenario which you would consider?
Well, yes, of course, and it's got its assets. I mean, actually, urban gardens, for all sorts of reasons, and one reason being that walls are fabulous storage heaters.
Right.
So you can, if the vertical horticulture, the vertical garden as it's called, can be extraordinarily productive. So yes, is the answer. I mean, they can be very productive.
Well, what does that do with the ground? Because I know Glyn's fanatically keen on quality of soil and so on, but if the soil goes up into a 14-storey building...
I think again it's something that it's a new frontier, it's a new paradigm shift. One area which Colin's referred to a few times, which I think is an area which needs to be examined a lot more, is actual food nutrition. Gone are the days where we have 5 a day, we're up to 15 or 20 and we're still growing, and this is where I think the food security issue happens to lie. If we could get back down to the 5 a day, we're going to have tons of food, and it's now possible to do. But we're not going to do it under the current agrochemical systems. So it doesn't really matter where you grow the food, you've got to grow it where it grows, but you've got to try and get the microbes and the organisms and the nutrition back into the food, because I think that's what's seriously lacking.
Is it possible? Is anybody doing it?
Lots of people do it, aren't they?
Oh yeah, it's a big movement. You've got the pasture fed in England, they're doing it. You've got the agroforestry lot, and I would actually say all of them go and present at Colin's fantastic Oxford Real Farming Conference.
They do.
That's where the numbers are. That's the movement that's happening, and
Is it, what sort of numbers?
big numbers.
Yeah.
Big numbers.
I can tell you actually, I mean, the point is, there's been the Oxford Farming Conference for the last 60-odd years, the great and the good, big industry, department of whatever it is, don't call it agriculture anymore, but they get about 400 and something people, basically limited by the size of the hall, but I think they have a job filling it up. We hire the town hall and we invite people to talk about real ideas, and we get 700 people. 750. If you get more than that, the fire brigade come in and close you down. Right. So,
They're going to
One
have
of
to find a bigger space.
one of the visible tragedies in this island, in Guernsey, I was in there the other day, is the closing down of greenhouses, glasshouses. Now, those must have a use in the agriculture or growing today, mustn't they? Now, in Guernsey, it's covered in collapsing glasshouses.
That refers back to, again, another one of Colin's very good points is, and I've tried it, you go and try and rent or lease a greenhouse, and it's got commercial value on it. So you're talking, 50, 70, 100 pounds a square foot or something ridiculous.
But they're worth nothing as derelict greenhouses. And they're sitting there in Guernsey by the score, waiting to be rezoned for building on. That's what
exactly, because it's more valuable as a building rather than as a food provider, which is wrong. It needs, that needs to be addressed big time.
And you don't think that warrants a revolution, Colin?
well, the point about revolution can be, in a sense, the only way out in the end. But the point about it is you never know where a revolution how it's going to turn out. It's, on the one hand, it tends to be violent and people get killed who didn't deserve to be killed, they were just standing there. But on the other, it gets out of hand very quickly. There's a non-linear relationship between what you want to do and what actually happens. And I like to say, for example, the people who kicked off the Russian Revolution, let's say 1917 as a critical date, never expected to finish up with Stalin.
But I think these revolutions are happening. I know it's happening here in Jersey. The social networking revolution, I like to call it. The knowledge transfer is there. It's almost like the universities happen to be online, and I know this is key to your college idea, isn't it? The online education bit.
Yeah, must be. Yes.
And it is the way it's going to go.
Well, even people like me, I know nothing about agriculture or growing at all. I like food, that's one thing, but I do read the internet and I see all these weird and wonderful ideas all around the world where people are producing huge amounts of food from tiny little bits of land. And I think, well, if they can do that, this little island could produce an abundance if it was properly managed.
Yeah,
it's a big point.
I'm sure you would agree there's no reason why we shouldn't, on Jersey, I don't live here, feed about 1 million people if one really wanted to put much mind to it.
All the best production, as everyone's referring to, is very small scale. It's very inefficient to actually produce massive scale. When you pull in disease, you pull in waste. When you see the amount of waste vegetables just spread across the land afterwards because they're not the right size, shape, or they've got an imperfection that the supermarkets won't touch. We've got to get away from this, this supermarket-driven entity and go back to this social system of feeding ourselves. The small farm is
Well, it's ironic, even supermarkets themselves are tending to go back to smaller shops. They've got these little express shops all over. I mean, their own marketing technique is showing what the way the public wants.
It's a great pity that they've reinvented the small shop, kicked out all the small shopkeepers.
That's right.
You could call that robbery, couldn't you, really?
Anything else you want to tell me?
Covered it.
No.
But I wish I'd recorded your talk, but there we are, never mind.
Okay, that's very kind of you.
When you next come back, we will record you.
Okay, right, good.
Or come over to Colin's fantastic conference.
What are you going to take away from this, Glyn? What will you be going off saying? Obviously, you're going to be reading your book, which you've just bought. I'll put the
I've read this book. I've read it.
You've read the book?
Yes, I've read the book. There's some fantastic chapters in there and quotes and things, and it's nice to listen. I love the one, and I think the one thing I think Jersey could jump into, which didn't really come across, was the connection between business and farmers. Let the businesses start investing in the farmers. I think we need to start looking at that paradigm a little bit more, so that you build this connection up between the consumer and the producer. I think this opportunity is knocking at Jersey's door. We've got some big businesses who obviously want some good healthy food. Well, invest in it.
Well,
it's about that time.
We've got to close up, but I was amazed when I went to look at the potato processing factory that they've got here now, the firm from Scotland. An enormous piece of land they've turned over to this wonderful facility, and it's like a hospital inside, clinically clean, and they recycle all the water that they wash the potatoes with. It was super, and they got wonderful machinery in there, so they've obviously put a huge amount of investment in it. And I thought, well, this isn't how potatoes used to be, is it?
But it's only as healthy as the food is, and it all depends on that. There's not much product if the product isn't healthy.
Okay, very nice to speak to you, gentlemen.